So I've got good news and I've got bad news on the program today. Don't you just hate it, though, when people say that, right? I mean, 9 times out of 10, the bad news sort of just wipes out the good news, right? I mean, that's almost like telling a kid, hey, we're going to go to Orlando. Bad news is we're not going to Disney, right? I mean, can you imagine that? It always seems that way whenever you hear the expression of good news. I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. Well, unfortunately today we've got some good news to share with you, but it is unfortunately offset by some bad news. I'm part of that good news, bad news themes. We're going to talk a little bit about interest rates. Good news there, right, is what we've been sort of talking a bit about over the course of the past several months is, my goodness gracious, golly gee, you're actually getting money in a savings account. Well, maybe not if your savings account was with a big giant banking institution, because those folks have been pretty reluctant to raise interest rates on savings accounts, but do a little shopping around. Maybe you go to your local community bank or just simply a money market. You're probably finding interest rates on your savings that are approaching 5%, if not right now, maybe a little over 5%. So that's the good news. The bad news is twofold. The bad news is interest is taxable. So the more money you make, the more you're going to have to send off to the government. So it may mean that you need to take a second look at what the quarterly payments are that you're planning to do for the month of September and January. So we're going to have much more of the conversation on that. Similarly, back to school has both good news and bad news, right? Particularly if you got kids in college, right? Good news is, okay, back to school, everything's sort of back to normal in the house. Lord knows they want to go back to school, especially if you're like me and you got some kids that are, late teens, early 20s. Yeah, they probably don't want to be hanging at the house with mom and dad. And I guess that's the bad news, right? They don't want to be hanging with us anymore. Not as cool as we all think. And so this weekend is sort of the middle weekend. Last weekend actually went up to Charlottesville, helped the middle son move in to UVA. This weekend is the off weekend, but next weekend, the youngest son hops on a plane, goes up to Boston to start his second year up there. So as you're going through this, and I'm sure a lot of parents are going through it as well, the reality is that while you may be packing the car and getting things ready and getting all of that in order, don't forget that they're now 18 years of age. And with that comes some legal steps that you should be taking beyond just helping them pack the car, helping them choose a meal plan. I don't know about you, but I mean, the meal plan thing is ridiculous. I mean, it shouldn't be that hard, but it's ridiculous. Anyway, once you've managed to navigate through all of that, though, understand that you are sending off what is legally regarded as an adult, which means that you probably also should have some legal documents in place, because as an adult, or as an adult and no longer a child, you, the parent, don't have the same rights that you had when the child was a child and not an adult over age 18 in the eyes of the law. So we're going to talk about those documents here on the program. Welcome on into Dollars and Cents. This is where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. And boy, a lot of dollars involved in college these days, that is for sure. My name is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great folks that stand ready this week to help you improve your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. So great news on interest rates, right? We've certainly talked about that on the program before. After 20 plus years of basically zero return, Money market rates now approaching 5%. That is the good news. And that message is coming across loud and clear to the investing public, particularly when it comes to their savings. Now, let me throw in a word of caution here. Don't take your investments and stick them in a money market and think you're going to be fine. The reality is that one of the reasons why those rates are as high as they are is because of inflation. So you still have to maintain sort of that traditional asset allocation. But when it comes to your cash savings, my goodness, what an opportunity to finally make some money on that emergency savings money, that cash savings that maybe you're saving up for the purchase of a car or a new home or something like that. The message certainly being listened to loud and clear by the investing public. A record $91.1 billion flowed into money market funds over just the past 5 weeks. So a lot of money flowing in. The bad news is that it is taxable. So this benefit of a higher interest rate may have a little bit of a surprise to it, because let's say it's $50,000. Right? Let's say you got $50,000 emergency savings account. It's making 5%. That's great, but that means it's $2,500 of interest. That alone is going to create a tax bill of probably around $600 on most tax returns. So that's a bit of a chunk of money that you might not have planned for when you're thinking about your taxes, particularly in terms of what you need to do as a result of that. The other key piece, and I think folks have sort of maybe forgotten this along the way, because again, we haven't really been talking about interest or interest on savings. The tax rate on interest is very different than the tax rate on, say, a dividend. The tax rate on a dividend can be as low as 0% and then up to 15%, assuming it's a qualified dividend. The tax rate on your interest is going to be based upon your marginal bracket. So maybe that's 12%, maybe that's 22%, maybe that's 24%. So a very different tax rate applies to interest. And again, it's a concept that hopefully we're all familiar with, but it's one that probably really hasn't swung our tax return much until what's going on this year with those higher interest rates. So we're going to be talking about that, some of the things to kind of be aware of and plan ahead. And then college, right? Classic good news, bad news. Love it when the kids are home. Sad to see them go. That means they're growing up. That means you're probably getting older as well. And certainly at this point, hopefully the good news is that, I mean, now's the time when they're going off. So hopefully you've got a pretty good handle on what you're going to pack and enough college labeled sweatshirts and cups and all of those kinds of things that you can possibly imagine. But the bad news is you're probably forgetting that they are now 18. And at 18, that's a different story. They're no longer a child, and you're no longer the parent in the legal sense of the word. You are now two separate adults. And there is certainly a number of documents and a number of legal issues that need to be addressed before they go away. So on the program, we've got 5 different documents. I mean, hey, leave it to, we talk legal, okay, just expect that it's going to be a lot of stuff. 5 different legal documents that you should be getting your child/adult to sign before you drop them off at college. We're going to talk about what they are, what they do, and how they apply. Coming up next here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. Sort of a good news, bad news theme on the show for folks today. The good news is, particularly when you're looking at interest rates, my goodness, they're approaching 5% on a lot of money market type of accounts. Make sure you're taking the opportunity to really kind of shop around out there, because a lot of folks still have savings accounts that aren't earning what they should be. Most of that is because the banks don't have to increase those interest rates that they pay on savings accounts at all, really. It's based upon sort of them setting what the interest rate is. And obviously, as if they can keep it low, that is to their advantage. So make sure you're checking out the options on that. That's the good news, of course, is that you can actually find some options that would pay a little bit of interest on your savings, the bad news is certainly here in spades as to what that really represents, right? So thanks to higher interest rates, we're seeing interest rates on cash actually be the highest level that they've been for probably 2 decades. In fact, for the better part of the past 2 decades, it's basically been non-existent. But here's the bad news, right? How those higher interest rates that have allowed folks with their emergency savings and their cash savings to actually earn some interest on that is translating into other areas, right? So the higher your savings rate is, guess what? The higher the mortgage rate is. And this past week, we saw mortgage rates really jump up. I think on this past Monday, it hit 30-year fixed rate mortgage hit 7.5%, the highest that we've seen since November of 2000. So that goes back a long ways in terms of what we're seeing happening with mortgage rates. The 10-year Treasury note rose above 4.3%. That's last seen since 2008. So that's certainly the bad news side of this interest rate increases. Mortgage rates and things like that have really jumped up dramatically. Certainly some significant rates that fundamentally impact our ability to borrow money. The longer term impact, if you want to really lay awake at night and worry about stuff, is what the Treasury is going to do. Because during the course of this third quarter, between July and September, the United States Treasury is issuing about $1 trillion in new debt. Guess what? That debt's probably going to cost the old folks in Washington a little bit more because of higher interest rates. It's also going to put further upward pressure on interest rates. So certainly a very important issue to watch, particularly in terms of how that plays out on the finances. One of those interesting things that come as you see the cost of capital increase, and we've been talking to various folks around the office about this concept. You know, when we think about cost of capital, when interest rates are low, cost of capital, meaning, you know, cost of money is very cheap, right? So what that means is that nobody really stops to think about how they're using their money. But when cost of capital, or the ability to access money, access cash, actually goes up, then people start to make very different decisions. And what we're talking about there is that when capital costs arise, sort of non-economic options, and in this case, think silly options, so options that are present and you scratch your head on it, and the list over the past decade is certainly kind of long. You've got your meme stocks, you've got your crypto, you've got your NFTs, your non-fungible tokens. Remember those? Those were the pictures that were going to, you know, be the next sort of U.S. dollar currency trading. SPACs separately, special purpose acquisition corporations, all of that, right? And not really hearing a whole lot of that right now because it's all kind of melted down. And the reason is that, again, when money is cheap, it doesn't cost you much money to get your hands on it, then it kind of goes into some silly stuff because nobody really cares. Nobody's making real decisions. But when you start actually having a cost of capital, 30-year fixed rate mortgage at 7.5%, then you're like, well, wait a minute, that's kind of costly, and I'm going to make sure that what I do with my money is, in fact, the right thing. Similarly, you see that in terms of businesses as well, in terms of how that money gets used. So once money's got a cost, then folks take a little bit deeper analysis on it. Similarly, especially because if the money market's paying 5%, well, then you're like, wait a minute, why am I going to take a chance on something that, you know, might have a lot more volatility? So the whole mindset, I guess, if you will, really changes when you start to see interest rates as high as they have. And it's a very different mindset, and it's one that we haven't seen for 20 years. I mean, stop and think about those numbers that we're sharing with you on the program. Mortgage rates, 7.5%. 30-year fixed rate, 7.5%. Haven't seen that since November of 2000. So some pretty big changes, particularly in terms of interest rates. The other things that folks need to kind of remember is that an interest paid is not the same thing as a dividend. Not only is it not the same thing as a dividend, because first of all, interest paid is generally paid by virtue of an underlying loan or note. Contrast that with a dividend. A dividend is paid out of the profits of a company based upon ownership of stock. So interest typically associated with kind of a debt instrument, and dividends typically associated more with equity ownership. So the tax rate on dividends much less than the tax rate on interest. Interest is taxed as ordinary income. So what that means is that if all of a sudden you're starting to have more interest, then that means you're going to have an impact on your taxes. And the reality is that when you have interest, so let's say you've got a bunch of money sitting in the money market, or you've got some CDs or whatever the case may be, more often than not, there's not really any tax withholding that is happening on that. It's not like you're taking money out of a retirement account and you say, oh, go ahead and take 10% withholding and just take care of that and send that off to the IRS and we're all set. The reality is it's not really an easy way to do that. So if you've got $50,000 in a money market and the interest on that is $2,500, well, then that's about $600 more in taxes. Not only that, but certainly there can be some situations where the tax impact on that additional income can certainly have some major ripple effects, right? Maybe it triggers more of your Social Security to be taxable. Maybe if you're in a higher income tax bracket, it triggers the net investment income tax, which is an additional 3.8% if you've got above $250,000 of income as a married couple. So the extra interest can really create some bigger ripples. So here are, I guess, the three key things that we would say to really kind of take a look at, right? Make sure that you, of course, recognize the tax implications. Interest is taxable as ordinary income. Dividends, meanwhile, taxed at much lower rates. So if that's the case, then number two, you want to take a moment and sort of review where you are at, right? How much additional interest are we talking? What's going to be the ripple impact on my taxes? Because that may mean that you adjust your tax withholding. Maybe that's on your W-2. Maybe that's on your pension income or the amount of money that you're taking out of a retirement account. Or if you're paying quarterly, and we just spent some time this past week with a couple of different folks where we were talking about their quarterly payment. So if you think about your quarterly tax payments that you make, at this point in the year, in August, you still have 2 to go, right? So you've only got half of them behind you for the year 2023. So still an opportunity to sort of adjust those quarterly tax payments. And so you may want to consider doing that in order to get in front of the potential of a higher tax bill, particularly if you've got a bunch of interest that's coming into your return for the first time in a number of years, or for that matter, and this was certainly the case of one of the folks that we visited last week, there was a death in the family. And so that led to a certain amount of assets sort of getting shifted over into their names, and there was some tax consequence on it. And so in that situation, to kind of look at and adjust the tax situation is certainly makes a lot of sense. And then lastly, as we've been talking about, you know, the interest is taxed as ordinary income. The dividends are taxed at a different rate. So certainly some things to be thinking about, sort of that good news, bad news when it comes to interest rate. I want to take a moment as we slide to the break to thank some of the folks who shared some comments on last week's show. Had some folks that shared some personal stories with me about personal property and what happens when somebody passes. We talked about that at length last week on the program. Certainly appreciate those comments and feedback. If you're interested in sharing those with us, just go to our website and reach out to us through our contact page at NelsonFinancialPlanning.com. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, and you're listening to Dollars and Cents. So the kids are back to college. Had my middle son leave last weekend, and my youngest son is leaving this coming weekend. So we're kind of in that middle weekend where we're not gaining or losing anybody this weekend. But I'm sure many parents are perhaps losing one of their kids to college. And that, of course, comes with some good news and bad news, right? It's great that they are going off, living their lives, doing what they're supposed to be doing. The sad news is that, they're out of the house. So that comes with some very mixed emotions. The real bad news, and maybe I should just do a little tangent alert on where we're gonna go next on the program, but I really, this one really troubled me, and so I wanted to kind of share it with you because it relates to college. But boy, you talk about the bad news, and I don't know if you've heard this story, but it's been percolating around over the course of the past week or so. Particularly when this Wall Street Journal analysis of the 50 flagship universities across this country was made public. And there's been a lot of reaction to it. The reality is that if you are a flagship university, and the study looked at the spending habits and the growth and the cost of those 50 flagship universities. And if you think about a flagship university in a particular state, that is the university that is intended to be sort of the public university that is designed specifically to help educate the youth of that particular state. In my case, growing up in Maine, I wound up going to a flagship university. It was the flagship university of the state of Maine. It was the University of Maine. And at the time, way back when dinosaurs ruled the earth, as my kids would say, the reality is that it was much cheaper and then to go to a public flagship university. I mean, that was the point. Those schools are specifically designed to allow local kids of that state to get an education and have it not cost a lot of money. Well, hold on to your seats because this journal study was just unbelievable. The conclusions of the study were simple, that colleges, particularly, again, it looked at these 50 flagship universities, had basically been on an unfettered spending spree over the course of the past 2 decades. It had been 20 years since I stepped onto a college campus, but about 5 years ago when the kids were starting to kind of make those decisions and we were doing college tours, I remember just kind of being surprised and shocked as to what I saw. And maybe you haven't stepped on a college campus in a long time. I would encourage you to do that. You're going to be surprised. I remember one institution we went to had the largest indoor track. I'm like, these are kids, have them go outside. Why are we putting them inside? Another one had a esports lounge, right? That's what you need to send the kids off to college for, is to make sure that they can play their video games in a comfortable setting. But I kid you not, that's what these schools were doing. Several others had new student centers and pedestrian malls that frankly would rival Park Avenue here in Winter Park any day of the week. The Wall Street Journal analysis was shocking. These snazzy buildings, these layers of administration, the conclusion in all of this is unfortunately pretty obvious. Because who ultimately fits the bill? Who obviously fills that bill of the unchecked spending of colleges and universities in America today? Students. I mean, right? I mean, that's the customer. When you're a college or university, who's your customer? Customer is a student. That's who's paying for your service. The spending, unfortunately, is inextricably linked to the $1.6 trillion student debt crisis we have. Student loans basically used as a cheap source of financing for all of these university projects. And so here's the study's bottom line. Here's the bottom line on it. Spending was up 38% from the 20-year period from 2002 to 2022. That was more than double the revenue from tuition versus where it was 20 years ago. A lot of the colleges and universities made excuses to say, oh, well, our state support funding has been dropped. But what the Wall Street Journal analysis found is that for every dollar lost, there was an increase of $2.40. So more than made up for whatever the funding shortcut was. Effectively a 64%, this is what it translates to, effectively a 64% price increase for the average student. The study's conclusion: unrelenting growth and prioritizing of raising revenue over cutting costs. Sadly, the college rankings even reward big spenders as well. So the whole system is just skewed. What was even more disturbing is every college or university has a board of trustees, right? And so you would think board of trustees, just like any other board for a entity, has a fiduciary duty to make sure that the whole thing is not just going crazy, that the inmates aren't running the asylum. And lo and behold, looks like many of those boards barely raised a finger when it came to the fiduciary oversight that is required. There was little accountability and rubber stamped most of the decisions. I encourage you to look up this investigative report. It's pretty detailed. It's pretty thick. It's raising a lot of conversation among colleges and universities. Even good old here in Florida, University of Florida, right? That would be the flagship university for the state of Florida. The study concluded, and I'm going to read it. University of Florida in 2022 had more than 50 employees with titles of director, associate director, or assistant director of communications, roughly double the number that it had just 5 years ago in 2017. The school also employed more than 160 assistant, associate, executive, and other types of deans last year, up from 130, again, just 5 years ago. That unchecked spending, that growth, that building frenzy, all of that made possible by the student loan debt crisis in America. I'm sorry, I know sometimes when we've talked about this before, we've gotten some pushback from folks that are in academia, and I mean no disrespect. Read the analysis. Read what the numbers show. There's no justification in any way, shape, or form for these costs and how this money is getting spent. You want to send your kid to college? That's fine. That's your personal choice. Look, I've made that personal choice myself. All three of my kids went to college. They all went to colleges outside the state of Florida. The reality is, though, that for the vast majority of people, it makes a difference. And thinking back to when I went to college, I went to a flagship university. I went to a flagship university because it's the cheapest available option that I could afford. And the reality is that these flagship universities, and again, the analysis isn't even taking into account private universities. It doesn't even take into account anything at all, like with fancy private institutions with manicured lawns and all that. It simply looks at flagship universities, which are designed in the first place to be a cost-effective mechanism to provide students of that state to get an education without having to spend a ton of money. But their flagship university is no different than anybody else or any other college institution. Spending money without any regard to what the bottom line is. What was really shocking, and again, I don't want to, I'm probably already belabored this too much, but some of these are just staggering. The University of Kentucky upgraded its campus to the tune of $805,000 a day. University of Kentucky, one of the poorest states in the country, upgraded its campus to the tune of $805,000 a day for more than a decade. Its freshmen who come from one of America's poorest states paid an average of $18,693 to attend in 2021-2022. As a parent, as a member of this society, I think we need to start asking some questions, not about student loan debt, but how the student loan debt was used by the institutions that received it in the first place. Sorry. Anyway, we're going to take a break and get back on track here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. Well, we're going to try and get back on track in this segment of the program now that I've had a break to tone down a little bit. But I'll tell you, take a moment, Look up this Wall Street Journal investigative analysis of the spending patterns of the 50 flagship universities in this country. The conclusion of the analysis in this study is shocking. The unfettered spending without regard to cost, the rubber stamping by boards of trustees, it's just unbelievable. And at the end of the day, who fits the bill for it? The students. The students are the customers of the institution. So as an American, and you're worried about the educational system in this great country, these are the kinds of questions that we should be asking, not let's just go through and try and cancel a bunch of student debt and then ultimately have the taxpayer be on the hook for that. Why not go after the institutions that actually got the money from that debt and ask them to maybe reconcile a little bit on how they spent the money? It's a very different line of thinking, but I think you would have to agree that isn't that about what accountability is all about? Come back to the people who actually got the money and say, well, why were you charging that? And what were you spending it on? Anyway, I digress. We're talking good news, bad news. That was some pretty bad news. Similarly is the transition that we're going to try and make, because as you're dropping your kids off to one of these fancy colleges, if you're still deciding to go, you may be turning the car right around and saying, I'm not going to be a part of that. But the car's probably already packed. You probably got enough swag of university stuff. So, yeah, just keep on going. Anyway, remember, though, that the driver of the car, or the kid in the back seat, though, isn't a kid anymore. He's an adult. And at 18, then the game changes. So you have to realize that. And as a parent, what that means is that you don't have access to their health insurance information. You can't make decisions for them. I mean, legally you can't. They're 18. You can't have access to, like, their online logins or financial assets. The reality is, thanks to federal law, you can't even get access to their grades. That can be sort of a disaster, right, on a many levels, especially if the unexpected happens. So the reality is, though, that this can all be avoided, but it really comes back to, you have to understand that, wait a minute, they're not a kid anymore because they turned 18, they're an adult, and now they're in a different location than under my roof. And so different rules apply. So you need to make sure that you've got the right legal documents in place. So there are 5 different documents. I kid you not, there's 5, a host of legal documents that you really should look to get in shape before you drop your student off at college. So what are they and what they do? We're going to talk about that. So we want to welcome in everybody to the program. This, of course, is Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. We're one of Central Florida's longest running radio programs, coming to you on a host of stations throughout the Central Florida region. Also, one of the top 25 financial planning podcasts on the internet. Join us or subscribe to us on any of our podcast platforms. Once there, you'll see us in terms of the channel. If you have any trouble finding us on the channel, go to our website, nelsonfinancialplanning.com, and you'll see the icons. Click on them. That will get you directly connected. Once there, make sure you subscribe as well. My name is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great folks who stand ready this week to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. We're looking forward to the comments that we're going to get this week. After the last segment, I'm sure we'll get a few. We certainly did get some after last week's program, and we appreciate when people pick up the phone and give us a call or send us an email or reach out to us through the website to give their reaction to what we were talking about. A lot of people shared some stories with me about how what we were talking about last week in terms of personal property and how to divvy up personal property after someone passes really resonated with a number of folks as they shared stories about maybe a desk or Christmas platter or other property that they had gone through with siblings to kind of divide up as well. Also got somebody interested in that liquid IV stuff that I was talking about that really does help in terms of if you're dehydrated, and it's only 45 calories, so it doesn't have a whole lot of sugar in there. Certainly something you check out. So, as we do on the program, we talk about a range of stuff here. Anyway, let's get to it in terms of the documents that you want to have in place. So first one, HIPAA. Okay, a HIPAA release. That deals with your doctor and medical records. As a parent, with a child that's now an adult, you can't get access to those records unless you have a document signed by what is now an adult, your child, that allows you to access. That is legal document number one, a HIPAA release. Similarly, a healthcare surrogate or proxy is basically sort of a power of attorney as it relates to health-related decisions. So if there's some decisions that are to be made, maybe your kid was in an accident or got a concussion and not really capable of making those decisions, a healthcare surrogate would give you the power and the authority to be able to do that. The next one, and you may say, well, that seems kind of weird to include it on this list, but we think it's important, and that is a living will. The reality is that accidents happen. And obviously, if you're trotting out the living will as it relates to your college student, then a real tragedy has happened. But the reality is that that's what the living will is intended to do, is to cover those extreme situations. So hopefully you don't have to use that one, but certainly we put that one on the list as well, because again, the child, which is now a student, which is now an adult, you need to have those legal documents in place in order to properly make those decisions. A power of attorney is also probably a good idea. So that's number 4 on our list. Power of attorney helps you manage the finances, meaning that you can step in and help without having to seek judicial permission. Imagine having to go to court to take care of some business matter, financial matter, and the kid is, and it's your kid and he's 18 years of age, but you got to go to the court process. Power of attorney prevents that, which is why it's an important document. The last one is just the classic one. It's the FERPA waiver. So, this is the one that says that parents can't access their kids' grades, thanks to the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. So a FERPA waiver, which you're going to tell your kid to sign, gives you the ability to see how their grades are. But without it, you technically can't see that. So those are the 5 documents. Let me recap. HIPAA and HIPAA release, healthcare surrogate, living will, power of attorney, and a FERPA waiver. The reality is you might as well toss in your health insurance as well, because both of my kids went through this. Or the 2 that are still in college went through this. One of them just this past week, the frustration of uploading the health insurance card, and then, you got to get approval and all those kinds of things. So those are the things to remember across the board. So thank you for joining us this week. Certainly a good news, bad news episode as we talk about higher interest rates. The good news with savings rates, but the bad news with higher mortgage rates and cost of capital. We're going to wrap it on up and get on out of here. If you like what you heard or you're curious on more, make sure you subscribe to us on our various podcast platforms across the various platforms. Also, join us on our YouTube channel at Nelson Financial Planning as well. My name is Joel Garris, Certified Financial Planner, Certified Financial Fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning. Thanks for listening to the program.